Imagine you're standing alone by the water's edge. It's quiet, almost too quiet. The kind of silence that presses down on your chest, making it hard to breathe. The wind barely stirs, and the only sound you hear is the soft lapping of the river against the shore. Everything seems normal, peaceful even, until you glance down into the water, and something strange catches your eye. Your own reflection is staring back at you. But there's something wrong. You blink, and then it blinks back at you, just a moment too late. That's when you realize it's not just your reflection anymore. This isn't some urban legend or campfire story. This really happened. In today's video, we're diving deep into the terrifying account of someone who came face to face with the unexplainable. A routine fishing trip turned into a living nightmare, and events that unfolded by the river that day have haunted them ever since. They say the place has never been the same since the strange death of a relative at the very same spot. Maybe it was just an unfortunate accident, or maybe something far more sinister has claimed that part of the river for itself. One thing's for sure. After hearing this story, you'll never look at your reflection the same way again. But before we get into the eerie details of this bone-chilling encounter, make sure to hit that like button if you enjoy tales of the paranormal. Subscribe to Sinister Stories so you don't miss out on any more terrifying experiences that will keep you up at night. And don't forget to share this video with anyone you know who loves a good scare. They won't want to miss this one. Now, turn off the lights, sit back, and prepare yourself for a story that will make you question everything you think you know about the world around you. What would you do if your reflection wasn't yours anymore? Let's find out. The story unfolds in a remote part of town, where the river cuts through a thick forest, a place few dare to venture, especially at night. This river has always carried a strange reputation. Locals whisper about unsettling things happening along its banks, fishermen who disappear without a trace, eerie noises that echo through the trees after dark, and a suffocating stillness that envelopes the area like a shroud. As the sun dips below the horizon, shadows lengthen, turning the once peaceful surroundings into something far more ominous. The river, once a source of life and tranquility, now seems like a gateway to something darker, as though it hides secrets far older than anyone can imagine. The air is thick with humidity, and the scent of decaying leaves clings to the breeze. The protagonist, let's call him Jake, walks along the dirt path that leads to the river's edge, his footsteps muffled by the soft, moss-covered ground. Tall trees loom overhead, their branches tangled together, blocking out the last remnants of daylight. It feels like the forest itself is watching, waiting. As Jake reaches the riverbank, he notices how unnaturally still the water is. Not a single ripple disturbs the glassy surface, reflecting the dense canopy above with eerie precision. There's no sound, no birds, no insects, just the oppressive silence, as if the entire world is holding its breath. Despite the beauty of the scene, there's an undeniable tension in the air, a creeping sense of unease that gnaws at Jake's mind. He can't shake the feeling that something is off. He's been to this river dozens of times before, but tonight feels different. The trees seem darker, the shadows deeper. Even the river itself seems different, as if it's watching him, waiting for something to happen. The farther he ventures from the familiar paths, the stronger the feeling grows, wrapping around him like invisible fingers. There's something about this place, something ancient, something wrong. Jake remembers the stories. They say a man died here, a fisherman who was found at the river's bend, his face frozen in terror, his body untouched by any sign of struggle. The official cause of death, a heart attack, but locals whisper of something more, something that pulls at your very soul when you stand too close to the water. As Jake sets down his fishing gear, the hair on the back of his neck stands on end. He scans the treeling, but nothing moves, just the heavy silence pressing in on him from all sides. The river stretches out before him, a dark ribbon cutting through the woods, and as he stares into its depths, he can't help but feel like he's looking into something far more than just water. Something is lurking beneath that calm surface, and tonight, it might just decide to show itself. It all began innocently enough. Jake cast his line into the river, the quiet splash breaking the unnerving silence. He tried to relax, to enjoy the solitude, but that persistent feeling of being watched clung to him like a second skin. At first, it was subtle, the kind of paranoia that creeps in when you're alone in a remote place. He told himself it was just his mind playing tricks on him. After all, the river was calm, the forest still. But as the minutes passed, the strange sensations intensified, and soon, the subtle discomfort grew into something far more sinister. The first sign came as a soft rustling in the trees behind him. Jake turned quickly, scanning the tree-line, but saw nothing. The forest was as silent as ever, the stillness oppressive. Yet the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. He shrugged off, focusing back on his fishing, but his hands trembled slightly. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed something odd: boot prints in the soft earth near the riverbank. They were large, deep impressions, as though someone had been standing there recently. But the strange part, they led directly to the water's edge, and then stopped. There were no returning prints, no sign of anyone having left. It was as if whoever, or whatever, had made them had simply vanished into the river. Jake's heart began to race. He crouched down to examine the tracks more closely, running his fingers over the indentations in the mud. They were fresh, too fresh. But how could someone disappear without a trace? His mind raced through possibilities. A fisherman, perhaps? But no one else was supposed to be out here, especially not this late. A chill ran down his spine as he stood up, his eyes scanning the forest once more. The trees stood tall and silent, like sentinels guarding a dark secret. The air was unnaturally cold now, despite the summer evening, and a strange fog began to rise from the water, curling along the riverbank like ghostly fingers. Suddenly, there was a noise, a soft, almost imperceptible splash. Jake's gaze shot to the river, but again, nothing moved. The water was as smooth as glass, perfectly still, reflecting the darkening sky above. But something wasn't right. The atmosphere had changed, thickening with an almost tangible weight. His breath quickened as he realized he couldn't hear the usual sounds of nature. No birds, no insects, nothing. It was as if the entire world had gone silent, as if the river and the forest were holding their breath in anticipation of something. Then came the most unsettling sensation of all. Jake felt a sudden drop in temperature, a biting cold that seemed to radiate from the river itself. His breath puffed out in white clouds as the chill wrapped around him. He tried to shake off the unease, telling himself it was just his imagination. But deep down, he knew something was terribly wrong. That feeling of being watched had transformed into something more, a presence, cold and ancient, lurking just beyond the edge of perception. It was no longer just a feeling. Something was there. Something was waiting. His eyes drifted back to the water, and that's when he saw it. Just beneath the surface, something was moving. It was faint, almost invisible in the dim light, but there was no mistaking it. A dark shape, barely discernible, sliding just below the glassy surface of the river, following the current, but moving too slowly to be natural. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he realized that whatever it was aware of him. It was watching, and it was getting closer. Jake stood frozen by the riverbank, his mind racing between logic and pure fear. Every instinct screamed at him to leave, pack up, walk away, and never return. But something kept him rooted to the spot. A mix of curiosity and dread gnawed at him. His mind replayed the image of that dark shape moving beneath the water surface, slow and deliberate, like a predator sizing up its prey. Part of him wanted to believe it was just his imagination, that the cold, the silence, the eerie boot prints were coincidences. But deep down, he knew better. Whatever was out there was real, and it was watching him. The dilemma swirled in his thoughts like the murky waters before him. Should he ignore the signs, pack his things, and pretend none of this ever happened? Or should he investigate further, risk uncovering whatever dark secret this place harbored? Jake's heart pounded in his chest as the weight of the decision pressed down on him. The air felt heavy, thick with unseen tension. Every nerve in his body was on edge, yet he couldn't look away from the water. His hands trembled slightly as he weighed his options. the rational part of his brain battling the overwhelming sense of curiosity. But this wasn't simple curiosity. It was a pull, something deeper, almost primal, beckoning him to stay. Suddenly, a thought flashed through his mind, quick as lightning. What if it's not just a coincidence? The stories he'd heard as a kid came flooding back. The man who died here. The rumors whispered among the locals about the river taking lives. They always said he had a heart attack, but Jake remembered how they had found him. His eyes wide open, staring into nothingness, his face twisted in sheer terror. There was no struggle, no sign of violence, just that horrifying expression. And now, standing here in the same place, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something more sinister had been at play. Was he about to face the same fate? He glanced back at the boot prints near the water's edge, the ones that stopped abruptly, as if the person had walked into the river and disappeared. The chill in the air grew stronger, seeping into his bones. His mind screamed at him to leave, but his feet would move. He thought about calling for help, but his phone was useless out here, far from the town and any sign of civilization. He was alone, completely and utterly alone with whatever lurked in the shadows of the river. The thought of turning his back on it filled him with even more dread than staying. In that moment, Jake made his decision. He would face it. Whatever was out there, whatever had made those prints, whatever had been watching him, it was time to confront it. His legs felt like lead as he took a cautious step forward, closer to the water. His breath came in shallow gasps, his heart hammering in his chest. The mist rising from the river swirled around his ankles, cold and damp, almost as if it were trying to pull him in. His eyes never left the surface of the water, scanning for any sign of movement. The silence was deafening, pressing in on him from all sides. As he knelt down by the river's edge, he braced himself for what might come next. The dark shape had disappeared, but the water still held an unnatural stillness, as if waiting. His reflection stared back at him, pale and distorted in the fading light. But then, just for a second, he saw it again. That subtle shift. His reflection didn't move in sync with him. His hand, trembling slightly, reached toward the water, but his reflection stayed perfectly still, watching him with cold, lifeless eyes. Jake's heart dropped into his stomach as the realization hit him. This wasn't just a trick of the light. His reflection was watching him. And then, it blinked. Jake stumbled back, nearly falling into the river as his reflection slowly smiled, a twisted, mocking grin that didn't belong to him. This wasn't his reflection. It was something else, something dark and ancient that had been waiting for him all along. Jake's blood ran cold as he scrambled backward, his heart pounding so violently he could hear it echoing in his ears. His reflection, no, that thing in the water, had smiled at him. A smile that wasn't his own, a twisted mockery of his face, its eyes too dark, too hollow, and full of something ancient, something hungry. His mind raced as he tried to process what he had just seen. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a trick of the light, his imagination playing tricks on him after being alone for too long. But deep down, he knew this was real. The river had been waiting for him. The air around him grew colder, the temperature dropping unnaturally fast, as if the warmth had been sucked out of the world. Jake could see his breath now, small clouds forming in front of his face. The fog rising from the water thickened, swirling in slow, deliberate movements, as though it were alive, as though it were watching him. He could feel it now, an oppressive weight, a presence that pressed down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. Whatever was in that water, it wasn't just staring at him anymore. It was coming for him. With trembling hands, Jake tried to stand, but his legs felt weak, as if the fear itself had drained him of strength. His eyes darted back to the river, where the surface remained eerily calm, but the reflection, his reflection, was no longer there. Instead, the water stared back at him, black and bottomless. A ripple broke the stillness, slow and deliberate, as though something was moving just beneath the surface, and Jake realized with a gut-wrenching certainty that it wasn't over. Whatever had smiled at him from the water was still there, hiding, waiting. Suddenly, A low sound, like a distant whisper, rose from the water. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the forest. It was coming from the river, a soft, almost imperceptible voice calling to him. His name, Jake. Jake, it was faint, but unmistakable. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. The voice was low, almost soothing, but there was something wrong about it, something that sent a shiver down his spine. It was too familiar, like the voice had always been there, whispering in the back of his mind, waiting for this moment. Then, without warning, the water stirred violently. A dark, shadowy figure began to rise from the depths, slow and deliberate, as if it were emerging from some otherworldly void. At first, Jake thought it might be a log or debris, but as it broke the surface, he saw it clearly, a human shape, featureless and dripping, rising from the river like a nightmare come to life. Its form was vague, more shadow than substance, but its eyes, those dark, hollow eyes locked onto his, full of malice and intent. Panic surged through him as the figure stood fully upright in the shallow water, its body unnaturally still, save for the slow dripping of river water from its featureless face. It didn't move, didn't speak, but the coldness emanating from it was enough to make Jake's skin crawl. He wanted to run, to scream, but his body refused to move. He was frozen, trapped in its gaze, as though those dark eyes had pinned him in place. The thing in the water began to take a step forward, each movement slow and deliberate, as though it were savoring the moment. The whispers grew louder now, more urgent, filling Jake's mind with words he couldn't understand. His heart raced as the figure advanced, its feet disturbing the still surface of the river, sending ripples outward in slow, ominous waves. The fog thickened, swirling around its form, obscuring it slightly, but Jake could still see those eyes, still feel their weight pressing down on him. Every step it took brought with it a wave of cold that seemed to freeze him in place, until the figure was just a few feet away, standing at the edge of the riverbank. Jake finally found his voice, but it came out as a strangled whisper. "What? What do you want?" His question hung in the air, unanswered, as the figure took another step forward, its featureless face inches from his. The cold was unbearable now, seeping into his bones, numbing his limbs. The thing in the water didn't speak, didn't make a sound, but Jake could feel its intent, feel the hunger that radiated from it. It wanted him. It had been waiting for him. In one sudden, horrifying motion, the figure lunged forward, its cold, wet hands grabbing Jake by the ankles, pulling him toward the water. He screamed, his hands scrambling for anything to hold onto, but the ground was slick with mud, and he could feel himself being dragged toward the river's edge. The whispers grew deafening now, filling his ears with incomprehensible words, but one thing was clear. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't going to let him go. Jake's screams echoed into the stillness of the night, swallowed by the oppressive fog that now seemed alive, curling around him as he struggled against the icy grip of the thing pulling him toward the river. His hands clawed at the mud, fingers slipping as he fought with everything he had to stop his descent into the freezing water. His heart pounded in his chest, each frantic beat a reminder of how close he was to losing himself completely. But the more he fought, the stronger the creature's grip became. Its cold, wet hands wrapped around his ankles, dragging him inch by inch toward the dark, waiting water. Desperation clawed at his mind. Jake thrashed wildly, kicking at the thing that held him, but it was like trying to fight a shadow. There was no form, no substance to grab hold of, just a cold, unyielding force that seemed to seep into his very soul. The whispers in his head grew louder, drowning out his thoughts, filling him with a creeping sense of dread that tightened around his throat like a noose. The voice from the river was no longer soft and distant. It was inside him now, speaking in a language he didn't understand, but somehow recognized. It was calling him, demanding that he surrender, that he give himself to the water. Then, in a moment of terror-fueled clarity, Jake remembered the stories, the old legends about the river, passed down from generation to generation. They weren't just stories to scare children. They were warnings. The river had always taken something from those who ventured too close. Souls, lives, memories. And now, it wanted his. The realization hit him like a cold wave, freezing him in place. This wasn't just a haunting. The river was a predator, a living entity that fed on fear, on life itself, and had been watching him all along, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Just as his body began to slip into the water, Jake saw something, a reflection in the river, but not his own. It was the face of his uncle, the man who had died here years ago, staring back at him with wide, terrified eyes. His mouth was open in a silent scream, his hand reaching out from the water, as if trying to warn Jake, trying to pull him back from the brink. But there was something wrong with the reflection. It was distorted, twisted, like it was being pulled apart by unseen forces. His uncle's face melted into the water, dissolving into dark ripples that spread across the surface. Jake's breath came in ragged gasps as he realized the truth. His uncle hadn't just died here. He had been claimed by the river, just like so many before him. And now, Jake was next. The cold hands around his ankles tightened, yanking him harder toward the water. His legs were already submerged, the freezing water lapping up to his knees, numbing his skin. The fog swirled around him, thick and suffocating, as the whispers reached a fever pitch, screaming in his mind, urging him to give in, to let go. But Jake wasn't ready to die. With a final surge of adrenaline, he twisted his body, kicking with all his strength at the figure in the water. His foot made contact with something solid, a momentary resistance, and the creature loosened its grip, just enough for Jake to scramble backward, clawing his way up the muddy bank. His body screamed in pain, muscles burning from the effort, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The river was roaring now, angry, as though it could sense its prey slipping away. The whispers turned to shrieks, filling the air with an otherworldly sound that sent shivers down Jake's spine. As he dragged himself out of the water, the figure in the river let out a low, guttural sound, like a growl of frustration. Jake didn't dare look back. He stumbled to his feet, his legs shaking beneath him, and ran, blindly, desperately, into the forest, not stopping until the sound of the river had faded into the distance. His chest heaved with each ragged breath as he collapsed against a tree, his entire body trembling from the cold and fear. For a long moment, Jake sat there in the darkness, his heart pounding in his ears, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The whispers were gone now, the air still and silent once more. But he knew, deep down, he knew, that he had barely escaped. The river had almost taken him, and it would try again. It always did. Those it marked were never truly free. The creature that had emerged from the depths wasn't finished with him yet. As he looked back toward the direction of the river, a final, chilling thought crossed his mind. The reflection had blinked first. It wasn't just a mimic. It had been waiting for him all along, hiding in the water, and now that it had found him, it wouldn't rest until it claimed him. The river was patient. It had all the time in the world. Jake's mind raced as he sat, huddled against the tree, trying to catch his breath. His clothes were soaked, clinging to his skin, and his body trembled from both the cold and the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. He had escaped for now, but the river's presence lingered in the air, thick and suffocating, as though it had left a mark on him that would never wash away. Even though he was no longer near the water, he could still feel it. Its cold, dead grip, the sensation of being watched, stalked by something beyond human comprehension. The forest was silent again, but the silence no longer felt like a reprieve. It felt like the calm before the storm. As Jake rose shakily to his feet, his mind struggled to process what had just happened. The thing in the river, it wasn't just a ghost or a figment of his imagination. It was something older, something far more sinister. The stories about the river had always been vague, passed down as cautionary tales meant to frighten children. But now Jake knew they were true. He had seen it, felt its pull, and barely escaped with his life. The river wasn't just a place where people had died. It was a living entity, a force that consumed those who wandered too close. It had taken his uncle, And it had nearly taken him too. Jake's hands shook as he gathered his things, his eyes darting around the shadowy forest as if expecting the creature to follow him. But the river was silent once more, its dark waters undisturbed, the eerie whispers gone. Yet, something inside him knew that this wasn't over. The river had let him go, but not out of mercy. It was waiting, watching, biding its time. Jake had escaped, but not without consequence. He was marked now, tethered to the river in some inexplicable way, and he knew it would call him back, sooner or later. The journey back through the forest was long and treacherous, his senses heightened by fear. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent his heart racing, convinced that something, or someone, was following him. The deeper he ventured into the trees, the more disoriented he became. It was as if the forest itself was conspiring against him, twisting the path in ways that made no sense. The farther he moved from the river, the harder it became to shake the feeling of being pulled back, as though invisible hands were reaching for him from the water's edge. But somehow, through sheer force of will, Jake managed to find his way out of the woods. When he finally emerged onto the dirt road that led back to town, his legs nearly gave out from under him. The weight of what had just happened settled over him like a heavy cloak. He had survived, but it didn't feel like a victory. The river still had its hooks in him, deep and unshakable. The creature had let him go, but it wasn't finished. He could still hear its voice in the back of his mind, faint and distant, whispering his name, calling him back. In the weeks that followed, Jake tried to return to normal life, but nothing was the same. He avoided the river at all costs, but it didn't matter. The feeling of being watched followed him everywhere, creeping into his mind at the most unexpected moments. Every time he looked into a reflective surface, a window, a mirror, even a puddle, he couldn't shake the sensation that something was watching him from the other side. The reflection in the water had blinked at him, and now it felt as though the reflection was still there, just beneath the surface of reality, waiting for him to slip. His nights were plagued by nightmares. In every dream, he found himself back at the riverbank, standing at the water's edge, the fog curling around him like ghostly tendrils. The water was always still, impossibly calm, and as he stared into it, the reflection that stared back wasn't his own. It was the creature, smiling that same twisted, mocking grin, its dark eyes full of malice. In the dreams, Jake would try to run, but the water always reached for him, dragging him under, into the cold, dark depths where the whispers grew louder and louder until they became unbearable. One night, he woke in a cold sweat, the faint echo of the river's voice still ringing in his ears. The creature was calling to him again. He could feel it, deep in his bones, the way one feels the coming of a storm. Jake knew what it meant. He hadn't truly escaped. The river had claimed him, just as it had claimed his uncle, just as it had claimed so many others. It would come for him again, sooner or later. And the next time, he wasn't sure he would be strong enough to resist its pull. In a final act of desperation, Jake tried to warn others, his friends, his family, but no one believed him. They chalked it up to stress, to trauma, to overactive imagination. But Jake knew the truth. The river was waiting for him, and it wouldn't stop until it had claimed him. He had escaped once, but no one escaped the river twice. The river's reflection had blinked at him, and now it was only a matter of time before the two of them would meet again. Weeks turned into months, but the terror Jake experienced at the river never left him. He tried everything to rid himself of the memories, to forget the icy grip of that creature and the sinister reflection that had stared back at him. Yet no matter what he did, the river haunted his every thought. It was no longer just a place on the outskirts of town. It was part of him now, lurking in the corners of his mind, whispering from the shadows, reminding him that it was never truly gone. Every moment of peace he sought was shattered by an all-consuming dread. He knew the river was still watching, still waiting. Jake stopped visiting his usual spots by the water. He avoided fishing, the woods, and even the streams that ran through town. But it didn't matter. No matter how far he went, how desperately he tried to escape, The presence of the river followed him. Every body of water seemed to ripple with a dark, unseen force, as though it was connected to the same malevolent entity that had stalked him that night. Even the smallest puddle on the street would cause his heart to race, his pulse to quicken. The river had marked him, and there was no outrunning it. His friends noticed the change. Jake became distant, paranoid, always glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows at any moment. His nights were plagued with nightmares, endless dreams of the river, where the water was always still, and his reflection stared back at him with that twisted, mocking smile. In his dreams, the whispers from the river had grown louder, more insistent, calling him by name, beckoning him to return. The creature wasn't done with him. It had let him escape, but it had never released its hold. Jake was living on borrowed time, and he knew it. But the worst part wasn't the dreams. It was the mirrors. Every time Jake passed by one, he felt that same familiar chill crawl up his spine. At first, it was subtle, a lingering sensation that something was watching him from the other side. But soon, it became undeniable. When he looked into the mirror, it wasn't just his reflection staring back at him anymore. There was something else, lurking just beneath the surface, watching him with cold, hollow eyes. The reflection would blink when he didn't, or smile when his face was emotionless. It was always just subtle enough to make him doubt his own sanity, but deep down, Jake knew the truth. The reflection was the river. It had found him again. One evening, as Jake was washing his face in the bathroom, he looked up into the mirror and saw it. The same twisted grin, the same dark eyes that had blinked at him from the river that night. His heart stopped in his chest as the reflection stared back at him, not mimicking his movements, but standing still, watching. His hands trembled, the water dripping from his fingertips forgotten, as he took a step back. The reflection didn't move. It simply smiled, the same mocking expression that had haunted his dreams. And then, in a moment that sent a chill down his spine, the reflection spoke. Asterisk, it's time, Jake, asterisk. The voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it echoed in the small room, filling the space with an unnatural resonance. Jake stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat as his reflection, no, the thing in the mirror, tilted its head, as if studying him. The water in the sink began to ripple, just like the river had that night, small waves forming on the surface, despite the stillness of the room. Jake's pulse quickened as he realized what was happening. The river had come for him again, not in the water, but in the reflection. It had found another way to reach him, and this time, there would be no escape. Panicked, Jake turned and fled the bathroom, slamming the door behind him. But no matter where he went, the feeling of being watched never left him. Every reflective surface, windows, mirrors, even the glass on his phone, felt like a portal, a doorway through which the river was watching. He could see the dark shape lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to pull him back in. It was patient, relentless, and Jake knew that eventually it would succeed. In his final days, Jake became a recluse, avoiding anything that might show his reflection. He covered the mirrors in his house, avoided looking into windows, and even stopped going outside at night, afraid of what he might see staring back at him. But the river's call was growing stronger, more insistent. It whispered to him in his sleep, called to him from the edges of his vision, until one night, Jake couldn't resist it anymore. He left his home, walking in a daze toward the river, as though guided by an invisible force. The night was silent, the fog thick and heavy as it curled around his feet, leading him back to the place where it all began. The water was still, unnaturally calm, and as Jake reached the riverbank, he saw his reflection in the water once again. It smiled at him, that same twisted grin that had haunted him for months. And then, with one final, chilling whisper, the reflection spoke. Asterisk, welcome back, asterisk. Jake took a step forward, his feet sinking into the cold water, and in that moment, he knew there was no escape. The river had claimed him, just as it had claimed so many before him. The last thing he saw before the darkness closed in was his reflection, staring back at him, as though it had been waiting all along. Jake was never seen again. Some say he simply disappeared, But those who knew him, who had heard his story, whispered a darker truth. The river had taken him, just like it had taken his uncle. And now, when you walk by the water's edge on a quiet, foggy night, if you look closely, you might just see his reflection staring back at you, waiting for the next soul to claim.